One thing it's April 9th, 2025, Wednesday, Mark Kulak, 9:43 a.m. in the morning. This is episode 280.2. This is the fourth time I'm doing this video. To review this episode, this 280 series is the book Germs by Judith Miller. And the reason why I'm having to delete and redo the videos is because there is 30 to 40% of the book missing from the Amazon audiobook. I guess this is another big warning, though. If you think censorship is limited to Google, think again. One other way of censorship is by stuff being omitted from audiobooks. I never would have known it if I didn't have the book and I was looking at it side by side. So I'm doing this as much for me as I am for you. And because there's so much more content that was missing, I'm also changing the whole structure of the episode IDs in this series. So 280.1 corresponds to the preface and chapter 1, which I will be reposting later today. Episode 2, now episode 280.2 is going to correspond only to chapter 2 in the book. Episode 280.3 will be chapter 3 in the book, and so on and so forth. And I know it's not super smooth, but I don't want to spend more than another few days on this. Just the episode 280.3, I think between the missing narration that I had to do and getting that smoothed out with the narration from the audiobook, plus adding a couple exhibits in there to provide some backstory, was about a 5 or 6 hour project, give or take. Think of your average workday. That doesn't even include the actual 1 to 2 hours I sat down to do the narration and the collection of the content from Amazon. So episode 280.2 is going to correspond to that. So let's get going with Germs. Chapter 2, according to the book, is called Warrior. Chapter 2 in the book, PDF, starts on page 40. This is episode 280.2, which corresponds to chapter 2 in the book. In the audiobook on Amazon Audible, the audio for chapter 2 in the book actually starts at 28 minutes and 20 seconds in chapter 1 of the audiobook. Very confusing. Much of the audio is missing. As we find gaps in the book, we are going to click pause. I'm going to read it, and then we will resume the audiobook. Okay.
Warrior. Germs and warfare are old allies. More than 2 millennia ago, Scythian archers dipped arrowheads in manure and rotting corpses to increase the deadliness of their weapons. Tatars in the 14th century hurled dead bodies foul with plague over the walls of enemy cities. British soldiers during the French and Indian War gave unfriendly tribes blankets sewn with smallpox. The Germans in World War I spread glanders, a disease of horses, among the mounts of rival cavalries. The Japanese in World War II dropped fleas infected with plague on Chinese cities, killing hundreds and perhaps thousands of people. But despite occasional grim successes, germ weapons have never played decisive roles in warfare or terrorism. Unintended infection is another matter. European conquests around the globe were often made possible because the indigenous peoples lacked immunity to the invaders' endemic diseases, including smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and plague. But intentional warfare with germ weapons has been relatively rare, especially in modern times, and has been widely condemned as unethical and inhumane. Even so, in the early 20th century, Canada, France, Germany, Japan, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom were among the many countries that investigated how to wage biological war. All understood that the weapons they were developing were fundamentally different from bombs and bullets, grenades and missiles. These munitions were alive. They could multiply exponentially and, if highly contagious, spread like wildfire. Strangest of all, given war's din, they worked silently. In the days before atom bombs, germ weapons were seen as an ideal means of mass destruction, one that left property intact. Their main drawback was their unpredictability. In the close confines of a battlefield, the weapons followed the dictates of nature, not military commanders. They might kill an adversary, or they might bounce back and devastate the ranks of the attacker and his allies. Their best use seemed to be against a distant enemy, reducing the chance that the disease would boomerang. With intelligence agencies warning that Tokyo and Berlin had biological weapons, Washington began to mobilize against germ attacks in 1942. President Franklin D. Roosevelt publicly denounced the exotic arms of America's foes as terrible and inhumane, even while preparing to retaliate in kind.
The man chosen to lead the secret United States program was George W. Merck, the president of a drug company. Merck was a household name, and generations of physicians had come to rely on the Merck Manual, as the title, the Merck Manual, as a trusted guide for diagnosing and treating disease. Interesting absence of George W. Merck in the Amazon audiobook.
The new effort was designed to be nearly invisible, its degree of secrecy matched only by America's project to build the atom bomb. This germ initiative had its headquarters at Camp Detrick, an old Army base in rural Maryland that was close enough to Washington for quick responsiveness, but far enough away to ensure a margin of isolating safety. The work got underway in 1943 and expanded quickly. From a rural outpost in farm country, the base grew overnight into a dense metropolis of 250 buildings and living quarters for 5,000 people. The post was ringed by fences, towers, and floodlights. Guards, under orders to shoot first and ask questions later, kept their machine guns loaded. The scientists were issued pistols, which they kept at their sides or nearby on workbenches.
The headquarters building at the heart of the compound had its own set of armed guards on alert around the clock. All personnel had identity passes with employee photos, a security precaution that would become widespread in future decades. Persons leaving the post surrendered their photo passes to the guards. Accidentally keeping one could lead to arrest and interrogation.
The scientists toiled on agricultural blights for destroying Japanese rice and German potatoes, and anthrax for killing enemy troops. Bacillus anthracis is an ideal biological weapon, which one researcher called a professional pathogen. The microbe's life cycle begins when livestock graze in a spore-laden pasture. The anthrax bacillus can enter the human body through multiple pathways. It attacks the lungs when people inhale spores flecked off an animal hide. It burrows into the digestive tract of those who eat contaminated meat. Or it can infect the skin if it comes into contact with scrapes or open sores. Anthrax is a very rare disease in modern societies, afflicting a handful of wool workers and others exposed to large numbers of animal hides. The disease follows an aggressive course. Bacteria from spores germinating in the lungs produce several toxins that attack human cells. The symptoms are initially benign, a cough and fatigue. Patients often experience a brief recovery, the so-called anthrax honeymoon, as their immune system valiantly fights the disease. The respite is almost always temporary, and it is almost invariably followed by a collapse of the respiratory system and death. The disease follows a similar pattern in people who eat tainted meat. Over time, researchers managed to increase the potency of anthrax so that a single gallon held up to 8 billion lethal doses, enough to kill every man, woman, and child on the planet. They also learned how to reap the poisons that some bacteria excrete, a tactic that sidestepped the necessity of infection and instead yielded deadly toxins that could be sprayed directly on foes. One was botulinum toxin, the most poisonous compound known to science. It paralyzes muscles, including the diaphragm, without which the lungs cannot function, and its victims quickly die. In time, the scientists learned how to make botulinum toxin so concentrated that a pound of it, if properly dispersed, could, in theory, kill 1 billion people. None of the biological arms developed by the United States were used on the battlefield during the war, and afterward the effort slowed down markedly and shrank in size. But it endured.
One reason was that the Americans obtained thousands of records from Japan documenting the Imperial Army's germ warfare program during World War II. Japan had killed thousands of Chinese in widespread attacks with anthrax, typhoid, and plague on Manchurian towns and cities. Western scholars say doctors in the Army's infamous Unit 731 had also conducted gruesome experiments on Chinese and other prisoners of war, including Americans. Doctors had infected healthy prisoners with pathogens to learn how diseases spread. Many victims, or logs as the Japanese called them, were deliberately starved and frozen to death. Some were dissected alive. While 9 Japanese doctors and nurses were convicted after the war of having vivisected 8 captured American flyers, no senior Japanese official was tried for having waged biological warfare. And American officials granted Unit 731's chief, Shiro Ishii, and several of his associates immunity from prosecution in exchange for the voluminous records of Japan's germ program and their help in deciphering them. The scientific data were considered a windfall and carefully studied. Very interesting omission. Coincidentally, the German scientists that ran and oversaw and collected data on medical experimentation in Germany, Dr. Joseph Mengele, also evaded justice. In fact, it was learned that he escaped Germany and lived another 20 or 30 years in South America. Coincidentally, most of the records of the medical experimentation done on hundreds of thousands of prisoners in Germany disappeared. They don't know where they went, until some of them were found in the Vatican. Coincidentally, Joseph Mengele was helped to escape and avoid justice by the Vatican, where he went to South America. Why would the Catholic Church, the Vatican, the geopolitical institution of the Vatican, why would they help Joseph Mengele stay alive? What's the benefit? Why spend the money? Why the time? If anything, think of the political capital that should be available to any party, to any entity that says, hey, here's Joseph Mengele. Instead, they spent time, money, to protect him and to protect those records. And, no surprise, the medical records of horrific medical experimentation done in Japan was also protected, and the scientists that were involved in that were also given immunity. This shows a trend that there was a national security priority placed on protecting records, on protecting data related to medical experimentation during World War II, and facilitating the forgiveness, the immunity, or protection of scientists that performed those medical experiments.
The American military was fascinated by a weapon of mass destruction whose costs were so low compared with those for chemical arms and the atom bomb recently invented. The federal government worried that not only the Soviets, but other adversaries making similar comparisons would be tempted to develop pathogens for warfare. Pound for pound, germ weapons were seen as potentially rivaling nuclear blasts in their power to maim and kill, and some were considered even more destructive. In a secret report of July 1949, a panel of more than a dozen senior federal and private experts told the Secretary of Defense that germ weapons deserved more attention in planning and development. Such warfare was in its infancy, the panel said, and foreseeable advances would raise weapon effectiveness by a very large factor. Germ weapons, silent but deadly, were ideal for covert attacks. The resemblance of the results of such sabotage to natural occurrences, the panel said, would greatly aid clandestine use. It warned that germ attacks on the United States might be disastrous and urgently recommended crash programs of home defense involving collaborative efforts of federal, state, and private agencies.
Some veterans of the secretive work disagreed with the government's reasoning. Theodore Roseberry, a microbiologist at Fort Detrick during the war, assailed germ weapons in his 1949 book titled Peace or Pestilence. He warned that the field's promises were illusory and that its munitions had no real military value, since the outcome of germ attacks would always be impossible to predict or control. The expertise, he argued, should instead be turned to attacking infectious disease. His plea had no immediate impact. I'm going to add this to the list of books that I think we need to narrate. Again, this is Peace or Pestilence, 1949, by Theodore Roseberry. If you go to eBay, you can find 2021 reprints of this. I don't know how accurate they are. There's one version of an original 1949 printing on eBay right now selling for $450. However, I can find a suitable scan, a PDF scan with optical character recognition on the Internet Archive right now of this 1949 version printing of Peace and Protest by Theodore Roseberry. Interesting that they omitted this paragraph, because this paragraph suggests that there are dissenting voices who said this stuff is not useful. And, if I may, narrator's note, Theodore Roseberry was probably right. It's not useful. However, the national security priority is to maintain a lead, or at the very least involvement, in the advancement of the understanding of the human genome, because they don't know where it's going to go. William Caspers Patrick III was born on July 24, 1926, the only child of a Southern couple whose families were of Scot-Irish descent. His middle name was taken from a relation who was a Methodist bishop. His hometown of Furman, South Carolina, was a tiny speck of civilization that lay in the low country near the Savannah River. While provincial, with a population of about 100 people, the town and the surrounding area were a boy's dream. Patrick was serving in the Army during the Second World War when he first encountered penicillin. He received a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of South Carolina in 1948 and, a year later, a master's degree in microbiology from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville.
Upon graduation in 1949, he began working for a company in Indiana that made the new wonder drugs of antibiotic medicine. A research microbiologist, he helped pioneer ways to mass-produce penicillin and bacitracin, another antibiotic, how to keep bacterial colonies alive and growing, and how to extract the antibiotics. In his antibiotic work, Patrick was aiding one of the greatest and most inconspicuous of human revolutions. People in antiquity had lived an average of 20 or 30 years. By Patrick's day, the figure had risen to more than 60 years. By the century's end, in industrial nations, it stood at roughly 80 years. The lengthening of the human lifespan was due largely to the decline of infectious disease. One by one, history's great killers and cripplers, plague, cholera, tuberculosis, smallpox, typhus, leprosy, diphtheria, polio, influenza, dysentery, pneumonia, whooping cough, and a dozen other scourges had been vanquished or tamed. One day, Patrick got a call from a former teacher in Tennessee who had gone to work for the military on secret projects. His work, the mentor confided, centered on how highly pathogenic organisms might be deployed to help deter and win wars. He could give no details, such talk was forbidden, but the research was fascinating. He urged Patrick to sign up, appealing to his love of country and his sense of scientific adventure. The young scientist was eager for challenges and flattered by the attentions of a former teacher. In 1951, after a background check that took more than half a year, Patrick won a top-secret clearance and permission to work at what was then called Camp Detrick, the heart of the federal government's research on germ warfare.
In April 1951, Patrick arrived at the Fort Detrick Army Base on the outskirts of Frederick, Maryland. He was at that time 25 years old. Barbed wires ran atop its fences. In big, huge letters, it said, "Cameras are unauthorized." That's what the sign said on the front gate. Guards, armed and alert, stood at the entrance. Like all new employees, Patrick signed a waiver that granted the United States government rights to his body if he died from an illness acquired at Dietrich. Having done that, he received a series of vaccinations which were required before employees could go into so-called hot zones teeming with disease germs. He quickly learned the other survival rituals: the eating of antibiotics, the washing of hands, the bathing of people and labs in ultraviolet light, the wavelength best suited for killing germs. Caution also called for protective hoods and masks, rubber gloves and boots. The men often donned protective suits that made them sweat and itch. They breathed purified air. They stood for hours in hot boxes, glass housings with attached rubber gloves so the men could reach inside to handle glassware swarming with microbes or to assemble the guts of biological bombs. Despite the dangers, Patrick moved his family into the post in the year 1952. It had its own housing, theater, restaurants, and childcare. The social life revolved around the officers' club.
Patrick joined Fort Detrick when it was just beginning to stir. The outbreak of the Cold War and the Korean War led Washington to put new emphasis on planning for germ battles. The testing of prototype nuclear arms at sites in the Soviet Union and the United States was already shaking the globe. At Dietrich, construction crews built a hollow metal sphere 4 stories high. Employees called it the 8-ball. Inside, germ weapons were to be exploded, creating mists of infectious aerosols for testing on animals and people. Workers also erected Building 470, a windowless prototype factory for making anthrax. It rose 8 stories, a skyscraper among the low buildings.
Under military orders, often clandestinely, Dietrich experts fanned out to probe the nation's vulnerability to saboteurs. The scientists sprayed mild germs on San Francisco and shattered light bulbs filled with bacteria in the New York City subways, all to assess the ability of pathogens to spread through urban centers. The germs were meant to be harmless, but years later, critics charged that some had produced hidden epidemics, especially among the old and the infirm. After the Army sprayed San Francisco area with Serratia marcescens, 11 patients at the Stanford University Hospital came down with that type of infection. One patient died there. The doctors were so mystified by the outbreak that they wrote it up in a medical journal. The government later denied any responsibility for the death or other infections, producing evidence in court that its germs were not to blame. The scientific dispute was never resolved. The Army also studied the threat of enemies wielding a speculative class of munitions known as ethnic weapons, germs that selectively target particular races. One particular military worry centered on a type of fungus that causes fever, cough, and chills, and, if left untreated, kills blacks far more than it kills whites. The military feared that it would be used against bases where blacks tended to do a lot of manual labor. In 1951, at Navy supply depots in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, and Norfolk, Virginia, the Dietrich scientists staged mock attacks with a non-lethal variant of the deadly fungus. The depots said in a report on the action, employed, quote, many Negroes, unquote, whose incapacitation would seriously affect the operation of the supply system. American scientists also did outdoor experiments to assess how Soviet cities could be attacked with anthrax germs. Dry runs were made against St. Louis, Minneapolis, and Winnipeg, cities whose climates and sizes were judged similar to the Soviet targets. The effort was codenamed Project St. Joe. The clandestine tests involving 173 releases of non-infectious aerosols were meant to determine how much agent would have to rain down on Kiev, Leningrad, and Moscow to kill its residents. Each cluster bomb in the planned attacks held 536 bomblets. Upon hitting the ground, each bomblet would emit a little more than an ounce of anthrax mist. The disease, if untreated, kills nearly every infected person, a very high rate of mortality even compared with plague and most other pathogens. The snow was deep and the sky clear when experimenters in a special car drove into a Minneapolis suburb of homes, light industry, trees, and pine foliage to release the test mist. There was very little wind, and the winter night was marked by a strong temperature inversion. Overhead, a dome of warm air trapped cool air below. Air samplers showed that the release traveled nearly a mile. The experimentals wrote the dosage area was unusually large.
Until Patrick's arrival, America's hunt for living weapons had focused mainly on bacterial diseases, including anthrax, plague, and tularemia, a disease which kills 1 out of 20 people and leaves the rest very sick. Tularemia produced not only the usual chills, fever, and coughing of infectious disease, but also skin lesions larger than those of smallpox, ulcers up to an inch wide, their centers raw, their edges turned up in reddish mounds. But the shortcomings of bacteria as weapons were becoming obvious. Infections acquired in attacks on cities or battlefields could be successfully treated by large doses of antibiotics, the wonder drugs that Patrick, as an industry researcher, had been pioneering. That emerging fact of medical life diminished the role of bacteria as killers and cripplers for war. Viruses were a beguiling alternative. Compared with bacteria, they were less complex and often more deadly. To Dietrich scientists, their microscopic size offered a range of potential military advantages. A single human egg is just visible to the naked eye and has a width of about 100 microns, or millionths of a meter. Human hairs are 75 to 100 microns wide and easier to see because they are long. An ordinary human cell is about 10 microns wide and by definition invisible. Most bacteria are 1 or 2 microns wide. They and their cousins, such as the mycobacteria, are considered the smallest of the microscopic world's fully living things. By contrast, viruses are hundreds of times smaller and occasionally 1,000 times. If bacteria were the size of cars and minivans, viruses would be the size of cell phones. One of the tinier ones, the yellow fever virus, is only 2/100ths of a micron wide. The foot and mouth virus is smaller. Viruses are small because they lack most of life's usual parts and processes, such as metabolism and respiration. Scientists consider them barely alive, seeing them more as robots than organisms. To thrive and reproduce, they invade a cell and take over its biochemical gear, often at the expense of the host. Over the ages, this biological intimacy has made viruses one of the most dangerous of all humanity's foes. They include the causative agents of influenza, smallpox, and Ebola, the scourge from Africa that bleeds its victims dry. People can be powerless against them. Viruses are small enough to slip into cells where they are safe from the assaults of the human immune system. By contrast, anthrax bacteria, lumbering giants at up to 4 microns wide, must battle their way into the body, with many thousands of them often needed to start an infestation. Moreover, viruses are largely invulnerable to attack by antibiotics or other weapons of science because they are nearly indistinguishable from their human hosts. As an Army reference book on germ warfare put it, viruses may be particularly attractive because so few treatments are available against them. As Dietrich scientists investigated such issues, they did know of one treatment that worked against viruses: immunization. Most vaccines are made of viruses that are dead, weakened, or harmless, yet biologically akin to noxious ones. When injected, or in some cases swallowed, the vaccine sends a false alarm of pending attack to the body's immune system, which then forms antibodies to fight a particular type of invader. The defensive buildup is slow, so to ward off invaders effectively, vaccines must often be given weeks to months in advance. They seldom work right away. From the start, the Army knew that the protective action of vaccines could be turned on its head to make viruses more suitable for war. An aggressor could use immunization to protect his troops, while an unvaccinated enemy would be vulnerable.
As Patrick settled into Dietrich, the genocidal power of viruses was driven home by 2 dramatic episodes of pest control. The target was rabbits. The creatures had overrun Australia, their numbers competing so vigorously for sheep and cattle pasture that livestock production began to fall. In 1950, scientists responded with the virus that causes myxomatosis, a disease that often kills rabbits after leaving them blind and twitching. It spread fast and killed more than 99% of the infected animals. Europe in the post-war period had suffered a similar explosion of rabbits, which ate farmers' crops. In 1952, French experts released a few animals infected with the virus not far from the Palace of Versailles. By the next year, the disease had swept not only through France, but as far as Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Germany, killing up to 90% of the rabbits. Farmers were elated. In time, the experimentations were seen as vital to the post-war revival in European agriculture. The rabbit killing was of special interest to the American germ warriors because the myxomatosis virus is part of the pox family, whose most famous member causes smallpox. So the rabbit drama was considered useful in studying how the smallpox virus might spread through populations of unvaccinated humans. William Patrick III's credentials won him a leading role in Dietrich's expanding operations. He evaluated viral agents that the scientists were developing and did experiments to see if the microbes could be produced easily in bulk and still maintain their virulence. He was a production engineer, though at this time, in the early 1950s, he was also working towards a doctorate in microbiology at the University of Maryland. The Army needed large amounts of viruses to test for deadliness and, if it came to that, for making bombs. Patrick knew a lot about microbial mass production and quality control from his experience in industry. He advanced quickly, soon becoming manager at Dietrich's effort to make prototype virus factories. His foremost tool was the chicken egg. Cheap and simple to procure, eggs are rich in the proteins and nutrients needed for viral growth and reproduction and are surrounded by a hard shell that makes them easy to handle. Drug companies often incubate viruses for vaccines in eggs. At Dietrich, in a similar way, fertilized eggs were found ideal for viral mass production. Wielding syringes, Patrick's workers injected viruses into eggs and sealed them for incubation in warm ovens. The germs would infect the growing embryo and multiply, producing trillions of offspring. After a few days, the germs and their dying hosts would be harvested, the resulting compounds often pink in color. The viral agents would then be tested on mice, guinea pigs, rabbits, rhesus monkeys, and, in time, American soldiers. Narrator's note: interesting that they took out the sentence stating testing on American soldiers.
One insight the researchers drew from the preliminary tests and analysis was surprising and counterintuitive. Early on, the military concluded that killing enemy soldiers was unnecessary. In fact, viral crippling came to be seen as preferable to death, since an ailing soldier tied up more enemy transports, doctors, nurses, hospitals, drugs, and bureaucrats. Moreover, compared with the alternative, the incapacitation of troops could be billed as humane, no small thing in war, especially in a democracy where public disapproval could quickly end a military plan or operation. Viruses turned out to lend themselves to this subtle range of debilitation. Most viruses affecting humans were not lethal. In fact, like the common cold and the flu, most tended to be merely bothersome, if generally debilitating and only occasionally deadly. Over evolutionary time, the microbes had often found it in their best interest to keep their human hosts alive. Among the viruses that Patrick and his colleagues developed as weapons were those that gave rise to encephalitis, a brain disease of fevers, seizures, comas, and in some cases death. Another was the yellow fever virus, which causes chills, stomach bleeding, and yellow skin due to liver failure and bile accumulation. The scientists also investigated rickettsia, which range in size between viruses and bacteria. Like viruses, most burrow into cells to reproduce. Unlike viruses, some are slowed by antibiotics.
One rickettsia that Patrick studied was the Q fever microbe, an extremely hard germ that causes fevers, chills, and a throbbing headache, usually behind the eyes. All right, here's a quick video on Rickettsia.
Today, we'll be talking about one of the tick-borne diseases which cause severe illnesses and death in many healthy adults and children. These diseases are caused by a clinically important bug known as Rickettsia, and it's often tested in many exams. Let us start with a brief introduction about Rickettsia. Rickettsia is an obligate intracellular bacterium, which is named after Howard Taylor Ricketts, who identified the Rocky Mountain spotted fever outbreak in Montana. Despite the similar name, Rickettsia bacteria has nothing to do with rickets, which is a result of vitamin D deficiency. Now let us move on and talk about its important features. Rickettsia is a diverse collection of obligately intracellular gram-negative pleomorphic rods that are found in and transmitted by arthropod vectors like ticks, lice, fleas, mites, chiggers, and mammals. Its survival depends on entry, growth, and replication within the cytoplasm of eukaryotic host cells. Rickettsia species are known to cause two common diseases, including Rocky Mountain spotted fever and typhus. Now let us start by talking about Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which is caused by Rickettsia rickettsii. Rickettsia rickettsii is transmitted by bites of infected dog ticks. Rickettsia spreads via the bloodstream to infect the endothelium from the portal of entry in the skin, and sometimes they infect vascular smooth muscle cells, resulting in capillary leakage and vasculitis. Rickettsia species enter the target cells, multiply by binary fission in the cytosol, and damage heavily parasitized cells directly. During the initial stages of the disease, the patient could experience fever, nausea, vomiting, loss of appetite, conjunctival induction, which means red eyes, and a rash which typically starts at the wrists and ankles and then spreads to trunk, palms, and soles. Please remember that the rash on the palms and soles is a very characteristic rash seen only in Coxsackie A infection, which is known as hand, foot, and mouth disease, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and secondary syphilis. Now regarding typhus, it's a disease caused by two Rickettsia species, Rickettsia prowazekii and Rickettsia typhi, and is characterized by a rash that starts centrally and spreads out, sparing the palms and soles. Rickettsia prowazekii is the etiologic agent of epidemic typhus, transmitted in the feces of lice. If the host has Rickettsia circulating in the blood, and the lice attach to the human host several times daily to take a blood meal, then it will become infected with Rickettsia prowazekii.
Now it goes on for a few more minutes. Already there's much here that I was unaware of Rickettsia, its connection with typhus. I never knew this. So we continue to learn together. And it is small and it is intracellular. It's not just floating around in your plasma. It actually gets a bacterium that gets into the cells. Hence, it can be complicated and challenging to treat it with antibiotics because it is within the cells, which themselves may not take up the antibiotics. An interesting pathogen indeed.
In time, Patrick and his successors identified about 50 different viruses and Rickettsiae that were good candidates for germ warfare. That was nearly 3 times the number of suitable bacteria. The advances meant that antibiotics alone would be insufficient to protect people from germ attacks. One Rickettsia that Patrick studied was the Q fever microbe, an extremely hardy germ that causes fevers, chills, and a throbbing headache, usually behind the eyes. The Army, eager to assess the microbe's effectiveness, approved its being tested on people, which Patrick hailed as an experimental breakthrough. Tests on surrogates such as guinea pigs and rhesus monkeys left scientists unsure about the effect on humans. The test subjects were Seventh-day Adventists, conscientious objectors who, following the Old Testament's injunction not to kill, refused to bear arms for their country, but were persuaded to volunteer their bodies for germ warfare studies. At Dietrich, Patrick and his team made up batches of Coxiella burnetii, while working on a brand new structure of yellow bricks known as the Virus Pilot Plant, Building 434. Each day, its 34 employees can make quarts of test agent that swarmed with trillions of germs. Patrick had the slurries of Q fever germs carefully transported to the test sites. The first was Dietrich's own 8-ball. There, starting in early 1955, the Adventists gathered around the ball's periphery to don face masks and breathe deeply, inhaling mists of germs through rubber hoses connected to the ball's interior. Army experimenters administered a range of doses and droplet sizes to the men. Once infected, the Adventists were carefully monitored. If symptoms broke out, they would be given antibiotics to cut the illness short and avoid serious complications. Though often no worse than the flu, if left untreated, Q fever can progress to severe chills, trembling, blinding headaches, muscle and joint pain, diarrhea, weight loss, visual and auditory hallucinations, facial pain, speech impairments, heart inflammation, and congestive heart failure. About 1 in 100 infected people die. The Adventists were carefully supervised. All survived. The tests produced a surprise. It turned out that just one microbe of Coxiella burnetii, a single invader, was enough to bring on the disease. That discovery was a medical first. Such powers of human infection have been suspected, but never demonstrated.
Over the years, Patrick was often present at the sites where field testing took place, edgy how his germs would do. At Dugway Proving Grounds in the Utah desert, 30 Adventists were assembled in the summer of 1955 for the first American field trial of germ warfare agents on human beings. The test measured how well the germs spread. At the center of the circular test grid were 5 sprayers, each holding 5 ounces of Patrick's Q fever slurry. On the night of July 12th, after almost a week of false starts, a fine mist emerged from the sprayers and sailed on a gentle breeze. The test subjects were more than half a mile away, waiting nervously, increasingly cold in the early evening, trying to follow instructions to breathe normally. It worked. The pattern of infection among the Adventists showed that Coxiella burnetii was ideal for aerosol dissemination. The next hurdle was figuring out how to spread the germ in war. A key test centered on the nation's newest jet fighter, the F-100 Super Sabre, the first production aircraft to break the sound barrier in level flight. The jet was built to carry nuclear and conventional bombs. Now, a test model was rigged up for scattering germs. Mechanics strapped a tank onto the plane's belly and connected it to special nozzles that expelled the germs into the wind. The question was whether the turbulence would break enough of the spray into particles 1 to 5 microns wide, the ideal range for penetrating human lungs. The jet thundered over the Utah desert, and the method turned out to be remarkably effective. Only animals were exposed intentionally in this test series. But one F-100 pilot fell ill when he got out of his plane before it was decontaminated. The man had been on his honeymoon, Patrick recalled, and his wife looked like Marilyn Monroe. 3 soldiers were also stricken as they manned distant barricades on a road at the proving ground's edge. Their job was to stop traffic if the winds shifted suddenly. The germs had sailed 50 miles. Patrick recalled, "We were overjoyed." The incident showed that the scientists' mathematical models for germ dispersion were correct. More important, Patrick said, it demonstrated that his team was beginning to produce, quote, a liquid product that was very, very good, unquote. The finding was celebrated, even as news of the accident was suppressed.
While the scientists at Fort Detrick carried on their work, American officials suspected that Moscow was engaged in similar experiments. This belief was strengthened in 1956 when the Soviet defense minister, Georgy Zhukov, told a Communist Party Congress that any modern war would certainly include the use of biological weapons. Soon Washington uncovered hard evidence. An American U-2 spy plane, while flying high over a desolate island in the Aral Sea, snapped photo after photo of dense clusters of buildings and odd geometric grids. Analysts at the Central Intelligence Agency saw a link to biological weapons. One day, Patrick and dozens of other managers at Detrick were summoned to a special meeting. Security was tight. Guards at the conference room door checked the security badges of arriving personnel against names on a list. After brief introductions, officials from the Central Intelligence Agency passed around the spy photos. The structures on the Soviet island were unmistakably similar to the bullseye pattern of rings in the Utah desert, where roads, sensors, electrical poles, and test subjects were arrayed at increasing distances from germ sprayers. The confirmation of what had long been suspected reinforced the conviction among the scientists that their labors were not only justified, but also crucial, if for no other reason than to threaten the Soviets with retaliation.
What they saw in examining the photos turned out to be a glimpse of a large enterprise that had long predated the American effort. It is now known that the Soviet program for germ warfare began in the 1920s and 1930s and grew steadily into one of the earliest and largest of the modern era, developing arms to infect people with anthrax, typhus, and other diseases. At this time, the United States had no germ weapons. Stalin's totalitarian rule poured vast resources into the endeavor, though in time his purges killed or imprisoned many leading microbiologists. The turning point for Moscow was the Second World War. The capture of a Japanese germ unit, the study of its techniques, and the resolve to strengthen the Soviet Union military after the wartime slaughter of millions of Russians helped renew interest in germ weapons. In 1946 at Sverdlovsk, military engineers set up a factory that specialized in anthrax. In 1947, outside Zagorsk, the Soviet military built a complex for making viral weapons, including smallpox. By 1956, when the U-2 planes started flying over the Soviet Union, Moscow had built many secret bases across the land for developing and producing germ weapons.
Worried about the Soviet program and impressed with the powers of viruses and rickettsia to cripple and kill, the United States in the late 1950s prepared to build factories capable of producing enough pathogens and biological toxins to fight wars. Officially, American policy at that time was no first use. Biological weapons were to be fired only in response to an enemy's germ attacks. In 1956, at the age of 30, Patrick won a promotion and soon became responsible for designing a distant plant where the production methods perfected at Dietrich would be reproduced on a large scale. The new facility would make viruses not by the ounce, but also by the gallon and the drum. The site was the Pine Bluff Arsenal, an Army base that had been carved out of the woods of central Arkansas.
Also noteworthy, the state of Arkansas was the leading producer of eggs.
The Army was already using Pine Bluff to make weapons from bacteria, including those that cause tularemia. Under Patrick, it expanded into viruses. He worked with contractors and engineers on the design of the Pine Bluff virus plant, which was known as X-1002.
Its main function was to infect and harvest many thousands of eggs quickly. Workers at Dietrich pushed around heavy metal trays, each holding 60 eggs. At Pine Bluff, Patrick mechanized the process with conveyor belts. By trial and error, he found that if egg trays moved past workstations slowly, at 15 inches per minute, the operators would lose their concentration. But Patrick then recalled, quote, "If you moved it at 22 or 23 inches per minute, emotionally they could not accept that speed and would throw their hands up and quit," he recalled. "We found that 20 inches per minute was just right," unquote.
In time, Patrick's production lines began to hum and produce the germ responsible for Q fever. In a week, workers at X-1002 could infect and process about 120,000 eggs, which in turn produced 120 gallons of agent, enough to cripple millions of people. The pace of production was even higher for the virus that caused Venezuelan equine encephalitis, or VEE. In a week, workers on the mechanized line could produce nearly 500 gallons of noxious agent. Patrick knew the VEE symptoms well because an accidental outbreak at Dietrich had once sickened 15 members of his crew. "It's not lethal," he said of the disease. "It just makes you think you want to die. Your eyes want to pop out of your head." Public health workers also knew the disease well because VEE is indigenous to Florida, Trinidad, Mexico, and Central and South America, places where mosquitoes carry the virus.
The disease strikes suddenly to cause malaise, severe headaches, high fevers, painful sensitivity to light, nausea, vomiting, cough, and diarrhea.
The fatality rate, less than 1% in adults, is higher among the old, the young, and the infirm. Survivors can have permanent neurologic damage.
President Dwight D. Eisenhower was briefed on Fort Detrick's advances just before he left the White House. The full meeting of the National Security Council took place on February 18, 1960. Absent was Richard M. Nixon, the vice president, who was preparing his own run for president. Eisenhower was trying to leave a legacy of growing trust between the superpowers, with disarmament underway and defense budgets declining. But the Democrats were calling for steep rises in defense spending, and Eisenhower deeply resented their charge that America had fallen behind in missile forces. He saw the attacks as partisan. At the meeting, Herbert F. York, a nuclear arms designer newly appointed as the Pentagon's chief scientist and its number 3 official, told Eisenhower that the field of controlled incapacitation promised to, quote, open up a new dimension of warfare, unquote. The weapons, he said, were non-lethal. Instead of killing, they caused lethargy, irritation, blackout, paralysis, illness, and the lack of will to fight. The effects would be temporary, York said, though minor repercussions, quote, might persist permanently, unquote. Agents such as Q fever and Venezuelan equine encephalitis were becoming more concentrated, he said, and scientists were finding ways to extend their storage lives from 1 to 3 years. In the future, he said, Army scientists would produce a new agent, an African virus that causes rift fever, a hemorrhagic disease of chills, bleeding, and stupor in most victims rather than death, as well as, quote, tailored variants, unquote, of other agents. The new arms promised a military advantage. By contrast, York noted most Soviet biological agents were lethal. General Lyman Lemnitzer, the Army Chief of Staff, described how the weapons might be used. They could blanket large areas and infect heavy casualties without destroying buildings or property. Their potential was especially great, he said, quote, where friendly civilians may be present in an area occupied by enemy forces, unquote, or a situation that might arise in the Philippines or Indochina. Lemnitzer gave a hypothetical example. If communist forces seized an important region, the United States could respond with an attack of the encephalitis virus. Planes could drop bomblets or spray agent on the contested area. 2 medium bombers, he said, might be enough. In 3 days after the agent had taken effect, planes would fly in American or Allied parachutists to reclaim the territory. York said such weapons were potentially revolutionary. The diseases could be as mildly disabling as influenza or as deadly as atomic bombs. Over the next 5 years, he added, the Pentagon wanted to invest more money in research and weapons production. George B. Kistiakowsky, the president's science advisor, said the field's prospects were definitely bright and backed a budget increase. President Eisenhower concurred. Thomas S. Gates, Jr., the Secretary of Defense, asked what the world would think about the use of such weapons and wondered if they should be thought of as tantamount to nuclear arms. Gordon Gray, the president's national security advisor, noted that under current United States policy, the use of either chemical or biological weapons required the president's approval. Eisenhower, who had more combat experience than anyone else in the room, called incapacitating agents a splendid idea, in his words, that nonetheless posed one great difficulty. An enemy might consider their use as full-fledged germ warfare and retaliate with lethal agents. General Nathan F. Twining, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, agreed. He said that if the United States were to ever use such incapacitating agents, in his words, we should publicize their non-lethal effects to the greatest extent possible. In an interview years later, York said that in time his own enthusiasm for non-lethal weapons gave way to deep skepticism because of the problem that Eisenhower had identified. An assault with incapacitating agents, though billed by the attacker as humane, he said, would surely invite terrible revenge.
Spending on biological weapons rose dramatically after John F. Kennedy took office in January 1961. Robert S. McNamara, the new Secretary of Defense, did a sweeping review of military programs, including biological weapons. The Joint Chiefs of Staff found that the arms had unique advantages, especially their ability to incapacitate rather than kill. They strongly endorsed a crash program to prepare the germs for war.
The virus work, already a high priority, was redoubled, and such companies as General Electric, Booz Allen, Lockheed, Rand, Monsanto, Goodyear, General Dynamics, Aerojet General, North American Aviation, Litton Systems, and even General Mills, maker of Cheerios and Wheaties, joined the germ program. Quietly, the purveyor of dry cereals built a line source disseminator, a device meant to spray germs continuously from airplanes to ensure wide swaths of infective mists.
Eager for flexibility and greater range, Pentagon planners readied a half-dozen missiles for biological warheads, including the Pershing, the Regulus, and the Sergeant. The payload for the Sergeant consisted of 720 bomblets, each 3 inches wide, holding 7 ounces of disease agent. Released 10 miles up at the fringes of the atmosphere, the bomblets would scatter during their downward plunge to cover more than 60 square miles, spraying agent into the air as a fine spray. Military leaders also directed that field trials fan out from the Utah desert to sites more typical of the target zones. To determine the usefulness in Southeast Asia, testing was undertaken in Okinawa, Panama, and the Central Pacific. Much of Russia is cold, so germs were tested in Alaska. The expansion produced a new military bureaucracy. Founded in May 1962, the unit had its headquarters at Fort Douglas, near Salt Lake City. Its hundreds of personnel oversaw the movement of ships, jets, people, gear, microbes.
Basically 7 full pages of text from the early September 2001 book is not in the Amazon audiobook. Let's read it. After Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba in 1959, American military officials drew up contingency plans to invade the island nation and topple the dictator. One of the most secretive was referred to by Fort Detrick as the Marshall Plan, an ironic reference to the American effort to rebuild Europe after the Second World War. The plan, never before revealed publicly, called for a huge assault by American troops that would begin with a biological strike against Cuba's soldiers and civilians. War plans are written to cover every imaginable scenario, but the Marshall Plan was a serious option, according to several American officials involved in the preparations. Over the years, the work included not only close collaborations with Fort Detrick's germ experts, but agent selection, casualty forecasts, and study of the weather patterns over Cuba. There were even drills to see how fast the required germ could be produced. The plan's specifics evolved as new agents became available and as the Kennedy administration's increasing investment in military biology began to pay off. Initially, Detrick could provide mainly lethal agents such as anthrax, but in the early 1960s, as production increased at the new Pine Bluff factories, Detrick was able to offer an increasingly wide selection of incapacitants meant to leave most of the target population alive. Military biologists and planners argued for using such pathogens and biological toxins if the president ordered an invasion. Incapacitants could immobilize Cuban defenses, significantly reducing projected American combat casualties. As Detrick refined its plans for a biological strike, the Pentagon also investigated how it might produce fake incidents that could create popular outrage and backing for a Cuban invasion. Castro was to be falsely blamed for such covert American acts as hijacking planes, sinking boats carrying Cuban refugees, terrorizing Miami or Washington, D.C., and even blowing up an American ship in Cuban waters. The architect of the pretext strategy was General Lemnitzer, the same man who told President Eisenhower about the military uses of incapacitating germ weapons. Under Kennedy, he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Acts of subterfuge, Lemnitzer wrote McNamara in March of 1962, quote, would provide justification for United States military intervention in Cuba, unquote. Kennedy ultimately rejected Lemnitzer's ideas, and he was later shifted out of his post. The Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in October of 1962, bringing Washington and Moscow to the brink of nuclear war. President Kennedy ordered a large force to be assembled for a possible invasion. The Pentagon set more than 500,000 people in motion. It estimated that in a conventional assault, the number of Americans wounded or killed in the first 10 days of battle could easily reach 18,500, or roughly 10% of the 180,000-man invasion force. The Kennedy administration considered a wide range of military options against Cuba during the crisis, but there is no indication that attacks with germs ever figured in the high-level debate over how to dislodge the Soviet Union's missile bases. McNamara, Kennedy's defense secretary, said in an interview that he had never heard of the Marshall Plan. He added that neither he nor President Kennedy had ever had any intention of using pathogens or biological toxins against Cuba during the crisis. Philip D. Zelikow, Zelikow, a scholar who received security clearances to review the secret records of the confrontation, said he knew of no tape recording or document sent to the president and his senior advisors that made any mention of germ weapons. Narrator's note, this is Philip D. Zelikow, born 1954. His Wikipedia page highlights him as an American attorney, diplomat, academic, and author. He worked as the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, director of the Mills Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia, counselor of the United States Department of State. In late 2000 and early 2001, Zelikow served on President Bush's transition team. After George W. Bush took office, Zelikow was named to a position in the president's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board and worked on other task forces and commissions as well. He actually directed the Bipartisan National Commission on Federal Election Reform. He was also the executive director of the 9/11 Commission. All right, let's get back to it. Philip D. Zelikow, a scholar who received security clearances to review the secret records of the confrontation, said he knew of no tape recording or document sent to the president and his senior advisors that made any mention of germ weapons. But some in the American military, especially those serving at Fort Detrick, saw the Cuban Missile Crisis as a lesson suggesting that germ weapons might someday save thousands of American lives. And with the completion of new factories at Pine Bluff, it became possible to attack all of Cuba with incapacitating agents. A Pentagon official who had access to military archives said the options for a possible invasion of Cuba eventually included biological attack. He said that the director of the staff officers working for the Joint Chiefs had approved it. This official said the plan specified a combination of germs that could be used, and he estimated that a biological strike would affect millions of Cubans. It remains unclear how seriously this option was considered. The staff officers were less powerful than they became decades later, and their approval of plans advanced by the Army and other services and commands were often routine. Riley D. Housewright, Fort Detrick scientific director at the time, recalled that the planning was directed by Pentagon officials who encouraged the germ scientists to refine how exactly such an attack would work. Riley D. Housewright said, quote, "I'd get maps half the size of my desk that indicated position of Russian troops and weapons in Cuba," unquote. The military officials, he added, quote, "were very good at keeping us informed," unquote, while he and his colleagues in turn helped the officers judge the potential for success. In the early 1960s, Housewright said his men prepared agents that could incapacitate or kill large numbers of Cubans. One lethal alternative that was considered, he said, involved spraying enemy troops with botulinum toxin. Housewright considered the Marshall Plan a good thing, in his words, because it could save American lives in the event of an invasion of Cuba. Federal officials and germ experts, most speaking on the condition of anonymity, described the Marshall Plan's details and its range of destructive goals. Patrick would say nothing, even though other officials said the plan was modified over time to draw heavily on his work at Dietrich with incapacitants. But in a talk to military officers in 1999, Patrick did say that a Cuban attack plan had been drawn up, which relied on 2 incapacitating germs that worked sequentially to lengthen the time of disability. Patrick told the group, quote, "The concept was that if we got into a shooting war, that we could spray these organisms concomitantly," unquote. He went on to say, quote, "We could incapacitate the Cuban population from 3 days to a little over 2 weeks," unquote. "No infrastructure would be destroyed." He said, "We just make a lot of people sick. Very few of them were going to die. The germs would strike down old folks like me," he said, killing less than 2% of the population. He continued on to say, "We could move our forces in and take over the country, and that would be it." In interviews, Patrick eventually did describe what other experts said was a Marshall Plan drill. He said it was done in the early 1960s under secret orders from Dietrich and the Army hierarchy in the Pentagon. The purpose was to test whether the United States could mobilize quickly for a germ conflict. American germ warfare scientists had developed a special cocktail of 2 germs and 1 biological toxin designed to work sequentially so that victims would come down with uncommonly long periods of sickness and debilitation. Animal testing had suggested that the brew was potent. Now, Patrick helped prepare amounts that dwarfed all previous efforts. In all, teams at Pine Bluff made thousands of gallons of the cocktail, enough to fill a swimming pool. The toxin of the cocktail was staphylococcal enterotoxin B, also known as SEB, a poison excreted by Staphylococcus aureus bacterium and a main cause of food poisoning. The germ warriors made it into a weapon by cultivating up trillions of the bacteria and then concentrating the poison. Whoever breathed the vapor would fall ill 3 to 12 hours later. The symptoms included chills, headache, muscle pain, coughing, sudden fever up to 106 degrees, close to what produces a coma, seizures, and death, and less frequently nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. The fever lasted days and the cough weeks. The virus in the mix caused Venezuelan equine encephalitis. Its incubation period varied from 1 to 5 days, followed by the sudden onset of the nausea and diarrhea often associated with serious infection, as well as spiking fever up to 105 degrees. The acute phase lasted from 1 to 3 days, followed by weeks of weakness and lethargy. The final element was the bug that caused Q fever. Its incubation period was 10 to 20 days, after which it generally produced up to 2 weeks of debilitating symptoms, including headaches, chills, hallucinations, facial pain, and fevers up to 104 degrees. Chronic Q fever, the United States Army found, was rare, but if the disease progressed to that stage, it was frequently fatal. In the Marshall Plan drill at Pine Bluff, Patrick's work was considered essential because he had helped perfect the means of mass-producing the cocktail's 3 agents. SEB, that's the Staphylococcus aureus, the VEE, that's the Venezuelan equine encephalitis, and Q fever. Housewright said, quote, "We tried to have a lot of different agents available," unquote. The incapacitants, he added, quote, "showed that there was a humane aspect to the whole situation. It was not the same as putting an atomic bomb down their throat, which would have been just as easy or easier to deliver. It was a humane act," unquote. Exposure to the agents would debilitate Cubans within a few hours, and the incapacitation would last up to 3 weeks. Jets would tank up on Pine Bluff's airfield to fly to Cuba and spray the concoction over key towns, ports, and military bases, moving east to west with the trade winds. Havana, in the west, was to get special attention. The isolated Caribbean island of Cuba was seen as an ideal target for biological warfare, and the germs would pose no threat to American troops. None of the diseases was contagious, and according to forecasts, all of the cocktail's mists would have dissipated before an invasion. Cuba's population at the time was about 7 million people. The plan's estimates were that about 1% of the population, or 70,000 people, might die if all individuals exposed to the cocktail became sick. Though the Marshall Plan was never implemented, the emerging ability to conduct a new kind of warfare had potential repercussions far beyond Cuba. For instance, military planners also saw a possible use for incapacitating agents in Laos. Washington feared that the Chinese communists might try to take the country in a southward drive. According to a once secret report that reviewed American and Allied capabilities in 1962 for limited military operations, using biological weapons in Laos had obvious drawbacks. The report said, quote, "The spreading of sickness among people would be regarded as a friendly act by few of them. But if a biological attack in Laos produced a successful pacification at small human cost, such an agent might come to be regarded in a different light." Paraphrasing a little bit there.
In 1963, the Kennedy administration invited a number of academic specialists to Washington for the summer to offer advice on arms control. Among them was Matthew S. Meselson, a Harvard biologist who had recently done pioneering research on how DNA copies itself. At the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, Meselson asked if he could look into biological issues. The agency's senior officials, busy negotiating a treaty with Moscow meant to ban most nuclear tests, told him to go ahead. Armed with secret clearances, Meselson set off. At Dietrich, he recalled, officials showed him the munitions and explained how they could cause many casualties. What was the rationale, Meselson asked, since the government already had nuclear arms? Germ weapons were cheaper, came the reply. Meselson then asked the CIA if any other nations were developing biological arms. No, came the answer. There were suspicions about the Soviet Union, but no hard evidence. Meselson thought about this for a few days. The best thing for the wealthiest nation on earth to do, he reasoned, was to keep war expensive. Making it cheap enough for any dictator or undeveloped nation was a bad idea. Moreover, with biology every day becoming more powerful, germ weapons were increasingly dangerous. Meselson went to see McGeorge Bundy, who a few years earlier, as Harvard's dean of faculty, had originally hired him. Now he served in Washington as the president's national security advisor. At the White House, Bundy told the biologist not to worry. "We'll keep it out of the war plans," he told Meselson, "but we can't get rid of it because we have so many other things to do." In fact, the germs stayed in the war plans, former officials said. The budgets for biological warfare by this time were quite large, and there was no way the enterprise was about to declare itself useless. As the Vietnam War intensified, scientists at Fort Detrick redoubled their work on smallpox. This virus was no mere incapacitant. Smallpox was ancient, highly contagious, and killed about a third of its victims, mainly from blood loss, cardiovascular collapse, and secondary infections as pustules spread over the body. Many survivors were scarred and blinded. Health authorities estimated that it had killed more people over the ages than any other infectious disease. In the 20th century alone, it was estimated to have killed 500 million people, more than all the wars and epidemics combined, including the Great Flu pandemic of 1918 and 1919.
Just a note on McGeorge Bundy. He died in 1996 at age 77. He was a top advisor in the Vietnam era. He was an influential foreign policy advisor to Presidents Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, forceful advocate of expanding American involvement in the Vietnam War. In 1990, he joined the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Bundy was born in Boston in 1919, youngest of 5 children. His father was a noted lawyer who had once been secretary to Oliver Wendell Holmes, and he was an assistant secretary from 1931 to 1933 and a special assistant to the Secretary of War 1941 to 1945. Bundy was educated along with a young John F. Kennedy at the private Dexter Elementary School in Brookline, Massachusetts. It's noteworthy that his sister, Catherine Lawrence Bundy, also known as Lori Bundy, married Dr. Hugh Dudley Auchincloss II in 1915, whose son, Hugh Auchincloss III, became the director of the NIAID after Anthony Fauci and was actually a deputy director of the NIAID under Anthony Fauci for many years. Just a few notes on the Great Flu Pandemic of 1918 to 1919. If you go to Houstonic.live and click on playlists and then click on 1918 flu, we have a bunch of short videos on the topic. Of course, you'll find that the world population data actually suggests that there was no unexplained loss of 50 million people in 1918, 1919. In fact, the only way that many people could have possibly died that year would have been an unexplained one-time blip, an unexplained one-time boom of an additional 20 to 50 million births to offset it. There just is there's no data to suggest it. It has effectively been a lie that has been revised higher and higher and higher. Also noteworthy is that the initial estimates were 10 million. Most of the deaths were in the military. Many of those military deaths correlated to young troops who were ill, given experimental vaccines, and were sent across the Atlantic Ocean with animals that were very weak and very sick and often had flu symptoms and other bacterial infections. In fact, once troops were no longer put on boxcars and poorly ventilated ships in 1918 with all of these animals, remember, there were no Humvees or Apache helicopters, World War I, the flu outbreak ended. Continuing on with the book. The next two paragraphs were missed by the narration. As a rule, the American military generally avoided contagious diseases because of their unpredictability. I guess with the exception of World War I. But the rule had exceptions. Washington kept the smallpox virus on hand as a weapon for special military actions and the clandestine wars of the Central Intelligence Agency, which maintained its own supply. The secretive work on smallpox took place in the 1960s as world and American health authorities began a global effort to eradicate the dreaded disease. The highly contagious virus had been studied by William Patrick III and his peers at Dietrich, but unlike SEB and VEE and Coxiella Burnetti, it was never listed publicly as part of the official arsenal of weapons the government acknowledged years and decades after the biological program ended. Instead, officials tended to say that smallpox had been found unsuitable as a weapon and implied that it had been abandoned.
The smallpox virus, known as variola major, can survive outside the human host for days. Typically, an infected person passes the virus to 3 or 4 others in close contact, often by coughing. But the virus can also be spread by contaminated bed sheets, clothes, blankets, and handkerchiefs. Its contagiousness and high fatality rate are what make it so destructive and feared. Dietrich experts learned how to multiply the germ in chicken eggs and human tissue cultures and tested it extensively on rhesus monkeys, which came down with high fevers, pustules, and symptoms of metabolic crisis. Exposed monkey 3912, a report noted, developed a facial twitch and paralysis of the right arm and died on the 6th day after exposure. The biologist at Dietrich also found a way to alter the variola virus to make it even more durable and also devised means of clandestinely spreading the disease. Tiny aerosol generators, or atomizers, that could be hidden in everyday objects were developed. In May 1965, experts from Dietrich's Special Operations Unit took the system on the road, using men
In the battle between man and microorganisms, refrigeration slows down germ reproduction and metabolism. Typically, cooling also lengthens the lives of microbes. When microbes are frozen in exactly the right way, surrounded by sugar and protein, cooled quickly, but under high vacuum to remove ice in a process known as sublimation, they can enter a dormant state in which they behave like vegetative spores. This process is known as lyophilization or freeze drying. Once dormant, the germ remains asleep even when returned to room temperature, staying that way for years or even decades. Industry uses the trick to make dry yeast for baking. It is only when such hibernating organisms are doused with water that they revive and multiply, in effect rising from the dead. American weaponeers of the 1950s applied the new techniques to microbial agents of war. They found that in some cases, the process was so efficient it could make agents too strong. One solution was to dilute the dried agent with inert material. At Dietrich, investigators found that the drying process killed some microbes, but not smallpox. The virus easily withstood freeze drying. The drying produced, quote, no significant loss and virus viability, unquote, one smallpox study noted, adding that the tested strains showed what was described as a high mortality for man. Virulence could thus be preserved for months and years without refrigeration, making the old scourge ideal for modern war. After 3 years, dried smallpox retained a quarter of its strength, one study found. Moreover, methods were developed that turned the dried virus into a fine powder that was found to be easily disseminated.
Tiny aerosol generators, or atomizers, that could be hidden in everyday objects were developed. In May 1965, experts from Dietrich's Special Operations Unit took the system on the road, using men's briefcases to spray mock smallpox germs in Washington National Airport, just outside the nation's capital. The lengthy report on the secret test, which was done to gauge America's vulnerability to enemy smallpox attacks, concluded that 1 in every 12 travelers would have become infected, quickly producing an epidemic as the disease spread across the country. Smallpox would be an excellent choice for terrorism, the report said, because, among other things, a long incubation period of relatively constant duration permits the operatives responsible for the attacks to leave the country before the first case is diagnosed. The incubation period of smallpox averages 12 days, at which point the disease shows its first symptoms, including malaise, fever, headache, and vomiting. Though these tests remained secret, popular culture began to reflect a growing fear of germ weapons. A 1965 movie, The Satan Bug, starring Richard Basehart and Anne Francis, was the story of a madman who stole a lethal virus from a secret government lab to take over the world. To demonstrate his seriousness, he first killed the inhabitants of a small Florida town and then threatened to destroy Los Angeles.
In the mid-1960s, as American forces began to bomb North Vietnam, the military came to Fort Detrick to ask for help with one of its most vexing problems, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were using the jungle road as the lifeline for their war against the South. Nothing seemed to stop the movement of arms, not ambushes, booby traps, high-tech sensors, heavy artillery, or B-52 strikes. American military commanders asked their colleagues at Fort Detrick if biological weapons might staunch the flow. The planning turned to assessment of smallpox, a potential move that was logical, if desperate. A boomerang effect seemed unlikely since American troops were routinely vaccinated against the contagious disease, and North Vietnamese troops appeared to be vulnerable. In some ways, the setting was ideal. Though Vietnam had experienced no smallpox outbreaks since 1959, the disease still lurked in neighboring countries, allowing an epidemic to be attributed to natural causes. In the argot of covert operations, the strike would be plausibly deniable, a key requirement. But attacking with such a devastating disease had enormously potential drawbacks. The trail wove through 3 countries. Sickness and death could spread uncontrollably, possibly infecting allies and civilians, and North Vietnam could retaliate with other germ agents. The communist government had powerful allies in China and the Soviet Union, both of which had biological arsenals. The idea was shelved. In the years that followed, the American government took a leading role in the global effort to eradicate smallpox, which was still killing millions of people each year. with a determined program of vaccinations, doctors and public health officials wiped out history's worst killer in just a few years. Meanwhile, the American military's deliberations about a smallpox attack remained secret. Its outlines were known from news articles and such books as what we mentioned previously, Theodore Roseberry's Peace or Pestilence. In 1967, thousands of scientists signed a petition questioning the military's efforts. The opponents included Meselson, the Harvard biologist. His voice carried weight because he was a prestigious scientist with secret clearances. Another critic was Seymour Hersh, the investigative journalist who wrote an expose in 1968 that was subtitled America's Hidden Arsenal. Fiction echoed with rising criticism. In his debut novel, The Andromeda Strain, Michael Crichton imagined the military flying into space to gather pathogens for germ warfare. In the story, a satellite crashes to Earth and begins a deadly outbreak that threatens human extinction. Narrators note, the term exobiology, the study of life in space or elsewhere off Earth, is a term created by Joshua Lederberg, and Joshua Lederberg was the head of NASA's program in the 1950s to decontaminate and study and search for microbial life off Earth. However, Michael Crichton and Joshua Lederberg both denied that Lederberg was the source of the content for the movie Andromeda Strain, which we played here on Houstonic Live and reviewed. Continuing to the book. The contrast to The Satan Bug was telling. The military had now become the villain.
With public opposition to the Vietnam War growing, protesters took aim at the federal government's program for biological weapons. At Fort Detrick, crowds of anti-war protesters marched outside the gates, past armed guards and barbed wire. The American public, while knowing no details of what went on inside, understood that Fort Detrick was the hub of germ warfare. "They'd turned their back on you," Patrick said of the protesters, "but we thought we were doing the patriotic thing because we were risking life and limb." The risk was real. In late 1968, a high-speed centrifuge that was spinning test tubes suddenly broke down and shattered the glass vials, exposing Patrick's men to a fog of psittacosis bacteria. The debilitating germ causes high fever and a severe pneumonia with hacking coughs. Just before Christmas, the illness sent 5 workers into the base hospital. Opposition grew and found new outlets. At an airport, Meselson bumped into his old Harvard colleague Henry Kissinger, a history professor whom Richard M. Nixon, the new president, had recently named his national security advisor. The two men had worked next door to each other at Harvard and had talked on more than one occasion. Kissinger knew of the biologists' unease about germ weapons. "What should we do?" Kissinger asked. Meselson recalled, "I said, let me think about it. I'll write you some papers." One of Messelson's studies, dated September 1969, argued that the weapons, while extremely destructive, were unnecessary. A light aircraft could deliver enough to kill populations over several thousand square miles, he wrote. But the disease could spread far beyond the target area or create a long-term epidemic hazard. The same fickleness was true of incapacitating germs, Messelson argued. In an attack, they might actually cause a large number of deaths among both enemy personnel and intermingled civilians, or might cause too little incapacitation to be militarily effective. Messelson asserted that the nation's strategic nuclear forces were enough to deter attack. "We have no need to rely on lethal germ weapons and would lose nothing by giving up the option," he wrote. "Our major interest is to keep other nations from acquiring them," he noted, since the living munitions constituted cheap atom bombs. Germ weapons that could threaten a large city are much simpler and cheaper to acquire than the corresponding nuclear weapons. Messelson's arguments fell on fertile ground. For all the nation's work on germ weapons, the military chiefs and defense secretary found them of little use for the projection of American military power. And President Nixon needed a dramatic gesture amid growing discontent over the Vietnam War. On November 25, 1969, Nixon ended it all. The tests, the accidents, the war preparations. "The U.S., he said, shall renounce the use of lethal biological agents and weapons and all other methods of biological warfare. The U.S. will confine its biological research to defensive measures. The human race, he added, already carries in its hands too many of the seeds of its own destruction. Nixon had been in office 10 months. He made his announcement at Fort Detrick, smiling and clearly relishing his role as a peacemaker. Patrick was there in the crowd just feet away from the president. He later admitted that it was one of the darkest days of his life. He felt that the threat of responding in kind to foreign germ attacks was the best possible deterrent, and that the president was foolish to throw it away.
Biological toxins that were extracted from bacteria, such as staphylococcal and teratoxin B, were spared from the ban and reclassified as chemical weapons to evade the new policy. In January 1970, Messelson wrote another paper for the White House, which he said President Nixon read. It argued that classing the toxins produced by germs as chemical weapons was a technical distinction that undermined the administration's policy goals, as well as the president's credibility. Messelson wrote, quote, "The arms control benefit of our newly decided policy will be reduced if we maintain biological laboratories where secret work is done," unquote. An active United States toxins weapons program, he argued, quote, would prevent us from demilitarizing and declassifying our biological research laboratories at Fort Detrick and our germ weapons production facility at Pine Bluff, unquote. The next month, Nixon extended his renunciation of germ weapons to cover biological toxins. Detrick was out of the offensive business after more than a third of a century. The White House directed the military to concentrate on germs defense, the mirror image of its previous work. Now, the main goal was to foil a foe who might attack the United States with viruses, bacteria, or toxins.
The Nixon administration became the world's leading advocate for a treaty banning germ warfare, which Washington now condemned as immoral and repugnant. Starting in 1972, the United States, the Soviet Union, and more than 100 other nations signed the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. The accord prohibited the possession of deadly biological agents except for research into such defensive measures as vaccines, detectors, and protective gear. It was the world's first treaty to ban an entire class of weapons.
Just thought you might be interested in a video short I did some time ago on this topic, titled USA Rejected 30 Years of International Biological Weapons Protocols, only 6 weeks before September 11th, 2001.
As reported by many world media outlets, including CNN, on July 26th of 2001, the United States rejects germ warfare protocol. In Geneva, it says the U.S. rejected a draft accord to ensure compliance with the United Nations ban on biological weapons. Since the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention did not specifically state how to ensure compliance, the United States backed out of that specific portion. Note that the United States spent all summer in Congress talking about biological weapons. The DTRA had a convention talking about biological weapons 4 days before 9/11. Rumsfeld was worried about biological weapons from Iraq the night before 9/11. Yet only the USA said, you know what? We're backing out, and we don't want anyone looking at our stuff. Hashtag Bruce Ivins is innocent. Totally innocent. Absolutely innocent.
Well, that's true. Bruce Ivins is totally innocent, but that's interesting. Wow, what an amazing channel. More people should watch this channel. So, let us just review. The 1972 Biological Weapons Treaty was backed out by the United States in late summer of 2001. The United States spent most of summer of 2001 talking about the possibility of a bioterrorism attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center. The United States had 2 to 3 years talking about the potential need to have a mandatory vaccination program on the United States military, and of course the old anthrax vaccine, which is discussed extensively in this book, is definitely called out as being a problem. Maybe the new vaccines will solve the problem. The Defense Threat Reduction Agency had a conference on a biological weapon attack a few days before September 11th. In late summer, there were hearings about a biological warfare attack. hearings about what's going to do in response to a biological warfare attack such as anthrax in October, which were said to be a response to the anthrax attacks, were actually already scheduled, booked, airplane tickets booked, and everything else in the summer. Senator Joe Biden said the day before September 11th, 2001, that he was concerned about planes flying into buildings with bellies full of biological agents, such as anthrax or smallpox, and of course he threw suitcase nuke out there. And then there's this book, Germs, that we're reading here, which does make mention of Phil Zelikow, who went on to become the executive director overseeing the 9/11 Commission, Joshua Lederberg, who was appointed by Rumsfeld in October of 2001 to run the internal classified Pentagon investigations about the biological terrorism event. And it starts off talking about the anthrax vaccine and the need to potentially vaccinate the United States military to protect them against anthrax should there be a biological terror attack where the United States needs to go to war in a place which might have anthrax, stockpiles of anthrax, weaponized anthrax. Not to mention, the other book, which we still need to read, includes The Cobra Event by Richard Preston, which talks about a biological terror attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center or a lab leak and everything that's going to need to be done, the concern about bioterrorism, etc. And, of course, Big Shot AIDS Vaccine, which talks about Vical and VaxGen Corporation and a new era of vaccine technology, which potentially could be applied should there need to be an urgent need to produce something rapidly, such as an anthrax vaccine for the U.S. military, whose primary character in the book, Nancy Haygood, is actually the person who approached the FBI in 2007 and said that this Bruce Ivans is the person that was most likely responsible or capable of doing the anthrax letters. The same Nancy Haygood that this book suggests knew Robert Malone since 1989, and Nancy Haygood was actually the third most frequent co-author of Robert Malone's postdoc advisor, Murray Gardner.
And please note, this book, Big Shot AIDS Vaccine, which took about 3.5 years to write, was published, available for purchase, the week after September 11th, 2001, meaning that its release was basically at the same time at this book, Germs, which we are doing here in this series, meaning both of these books kind of build on each other.
Of course, Robert Malone was actually at the Winber facility throughout 2000 and 2001, which was capturing cancer data from the United States military and Walter Reed, and then doing God knows what with it at their brand new cancer research center there in Winber, Pennsylvania, 10 miles away from where Flight 93 definitely did not crash, near Shanksville. And that's an interesting bunch of data to collect, because if there was a new experimental gene therapy vaccine used on the United States military, such as a new generation anthrax vaccine, maybe from Vical, V-I-C-A-L Corporation, it might have actually caused a lot of increased cancers in the U.S. military, something you might want to track and collect data on.
But it was only a pledge, and the treaty was filled with loopholes. No limits were set on the quantities of germs that could be used for research. No standards were stated for distinguishing between defensive and offensive work. No forms of consultation were specified. No mechanisms of enforcement were established. Analysts inside and outside the government nonetheless saw the international ban as entirely in America's self-interest. Their logic was simple. When war was costly and military action required tons of advanced equipment and nuclear arms, only the wealthiest countries could play the game. Cheap arms of devastating force leveled the playing field, and that, experts agreed, was something that Washington wanted to avoid.
The last several paragraphs are mostly some reflection, and I think we can skip them from the narration. So that's the completion of Chapter 2 of the September 7th, 9th, 2001 version of the book Germs. And in this PDF that we're showing here, it ends on page 88. Chapter 3, Revelation, starts on page 89. Just for your information, and the current Amazon Audible book for Germs, we are currently at Chapter 1 at 1 hour, 7 minutes in, and 6 seconds. Again, The chapters in the book do not align with the chapters in the audiobook. I don't know why, but they don't. And it's very obvious now that a large quantity of content has been cut out of the audiobook. I initially thought maybe a few paragraphs. It now appears somewhere between 30, 40%, maybe even more. 30 to 40% of the original book is not in the audiobook, which would be fine if it said it was abridged, but to say it's the complete book, and the omissions seem to have a pattern of providing some damning evidence of what did happen on September 11th, 2001. So this concludes episode 280.2. Thank you for joining. Again, I apologize all of the deletions and reposting of these videos. Trust me, everyone is different because of all of the additional narration and all of the additional work and content being added and additional color and so on. Hope you continue to join me and the Houstonic community for the rest of this book. It's going to be quite a journey. And just wait until we get to the other books. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for all the supporters. The opportunity to do this. Take care. God bless.